In 1967, calibrated instruments recorded energy surges with no source. Physicists, engineers, and a criminologist all watched it happen in real time and signed their names to the findings. Then the institution that reviewed their work made sure almost no one ever read it. Rosenheim is a quiet Bavarian town, the kind of place where nothing happens and nobody expects it to. In the autumn of 1967, a law firm at Königstrasse 13 became the site of something that had no business existing in a rational world. Phones dialed on their own, fluorescent tubes unscrewed themselves from their fixtures and fell. Photocopier fluid spilled without anyone near the machine, and the power bills were arriving for electricity the building apparently never consumed. The firm's owner, Sigmund Adam, did what any reasonable businessman would do. He called the post office. They found nothing wrong. He called the power company. They installed their own independent meters, separate from the building's existing system, and waited. What those meters recorded stopped them cold. Massive voltage spikes, repeating, surging far beyond anything the local grid could explain, with no corresponding load inside the building. They had no answer, so they called in physicists. This is where the Rosenheim case separates itself from every ghost story you have ever heard. Professor Friedrich Karger and Dr. Gerhard Sieke from the Max Planck Institute arrived with equipment. Not notepads, not an open mind and a flashlight. Instruments, strip chart recorders, magnetometers. Everything they logged on calibrated hardware that left a physical paper trail. And what that paper trail showed was a pattern. The anomalies were not random, they clustered. They intensified at specific times of day, and they moved. When a 19-year-old office secretary named Anne-Marie Schneider was absent, the readings flatlined. When she returned, the equipment woke back up. Karger and Sieke published. They used the term recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, a clinical designation for a documented but inexplicable phenomenon. They were not fringe researchers. They were credentialed scientists at one of the most respected research institutions in the world, and they stated plainly that they could not explain what they had measured using any known physical principle. A criminologist named Albert Reimann had also attended and confirmed the phenomena were not the result of fraud. Multiple witnesses, multiple instruments, a paper record. By every standard of scientific documentation, this happened. What happened next is why you are only hearing about it now. The measurements did not lie. In the autumn of 1967, inside a modest legal office on Königstrasse in Rosenheim, Bavaria, the laws of physics were being broken on a schedule. Electrical engineer Paul Brunner from Siemens arrived first, dispatched by the local power company after the office's fluorescent tubes began exploding without cause. Brunner installed independent recording equipment, bypassing the building's internal wiring entirely. The surges continued. Voltage spikes of extraordinary magnitude fired at irregular intervals from a power source no one could locate. Brunner had no explanation. He had only the graph paper, and the graph paper showed something that should not exist. Then came the physicists. Hans Bender from the Freiburg Institute for Border Areas of Psychology was joined by two researchers from the Max Planck Institute, Friedrich Karger and Gerhard Sieke. These were not ghost hunters. Karger held a doctorate in physics. Sieke was a trained experimentalist. They brought calibrated galvanometers, electromagnetic detectors, and the full weight of institutional credibility. What they recorded over weeks of direct observation included spontaneous deflections in the measuring instruments that preceded any visible event, telephone calls being placed to the speaking clock at a rate physically impossible for a single rotary dial, and objects moving without contact. Drawers opened on their own. Paintings rotated on their hooks while the investigators watched. The equipment captured every anomaly in real time. Karger and Sieke published. They signed their names to findings that stated, in the language of physics, that the energy discharges observed had no conventional source they could identify. The common thread running through every documented incident was Anne-Marie Schneider, a 19-year-old secretary employed at the office. When she left the building, the activity ceased. When she returned, it resumed. Criminologist Joseph Ritter von Sachs conducted parallel observation and reached the same conclusion independently. This was not coincidence stacking on coincidence. This was correlation precise enough to constitute evidence. The term that emerged in the scientific literature was recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, a category that the broader physics establishment had spent decades pretending did not require serious engagement. The researchers were careful in their language. They did not claim the supernatural. They claimed the anomalous, measurable, and reproducible. That distinction would not protect them. The suppression was not dramatic. It never is. There was no single memo, no public retraction ordered from above. What happened was quieter and more effective. The Max Planck Institute distanced itself from the findings through institutional silence. Papers that should have generated conference proceedings and follow-up funding disappeared into the margins of parapsychology journals, a category academics had already been trained to dismiss without reading. Karger later recalled that the results were treated not as a scientific problem to be solved, but as a professional liability to be managed. The data existed, the signatures existed, the recordings existed. But in the formal architecture of 20th century German physics, none of it was allowed to matter. They did not need to burn the findings. They simply built a wall around them and waited. What makes Rosenheim impossible to discard is the layering of independent witness. Post office engineers who had come to investigate fraudulent telephone usage stayed to document phenomena they had no vocabulary for. Siemens technicians who arrived to debug electrical faults left with evidence they could not file in any standard category. A criminologist trained to detect deception found none. Two physicists with institutional affiliations published peer-observable data. Every professional who touched this case left with documentation that confirmed the anomaly. The only entities that did not confirm it were the institutions with the most to lose from confirmation. That is not a coincidence. That is a pattern. And patterns, when buried carefully enough, have a way of waiting. The instruments did not lie. In the law offices of Sigmund Adam in Rosenheim, Bavaria, 1967, calibrated equipment registered voltage spikes with no source, phone calls logged to the speaking clock that no one dialed, fluorescent tubes unscrewing themselves from their fixtures, and a pendulum clock rotating against its own mechanism. The German post office sent engineers. They found nothing wrong with the lines. Siemens installed an independent power generator to bypass the municipal grid entirely. The anomalies continued. Then came the physicists, Hans Bender from the Freiburg Institute for Border Areas of Psychology, and Friedrich Wilhelm Haack, and eventually observers connected to the Max Planck Institute itself. They brought their own instruments. They watched the needles move. They signed their names to documentation confirming that measurable, repeatable, unattributable energy events were occurring inside that building. And then a young secretary named Anne-Marie Schneider was identified as the common variable. When she left, it stopped. When she moved to a new job, it followed her briefly, then faded. The researchers published. The findings existed in the scientific record, and then quietly, systematically, those findings were allowed to disappear from mainstream discourse. Not retracted, never formally challenged, simply deprioritized, defunded, and buried beneath institutional silence. What was suppressed here was not a ghost story. It was a controlled, documented, multi-institutional confirmation that human consciousness may interact with physical systems in ways that shatter the foundational assumptions of classical physics. The Max Planck Institute, the most prestigious scientific body in Germany, had researchers in proximity to evidence that recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis was not a hypothesis, but a measured event. The implications were existential for the materialist framework that underpins modern science, medicine, and the mechanisms of institutional authority itself. If the mind can affect calibrated instruments without physical contact, then the entire architecture of what they tell you is real and what they dismiss as superstition collapses. They could not allow that conversation to happen at scale, so they made sure it didn't. The published findings exist if you know where to look. Most people never will. Anne-Marie Schneider died in 2019 without a mainstream obituary that mentioned what she was part of. The physicists who signed their names to those results spent the rest of their careers being quietly managed out of serious funding. Hans Bender continued his work at the margins of acceptable science until his death, treated as an eccentric rather than what the documentation proves he was. A rigorous researcher who found something real and was punished for it. The Rosenheim case remains the most thoroughly instrumented anomalous event in recorded history, and the fact that you are only hearing about it now, on a channel they would prefer didn't exist, is not an accident. It is the system working exactly as designed. What do you believe was actually happening in that building in 1967? Was it the girl, the grid, something older than both? Drop your theory in the comments, because the people who actually witnessed this never got to have that conversation publicly, and they deserved one. If you want to keep pulling these buried records into the light, subscribe and hit that bell. Every week we dig up another story they hoped you'd never find.